Yes, well, my name's Chris Makepeace and I'm a local historian, and I've been involved in work on Manchester's history since about 1965. So I've built up a fair amount of material over the years, and also I'm very much in favour of everything being kept and collected. And I think it's very important that every community, whether it's English, Chinese or anywhere, preserve for the future the records of today for the people tomorrow. It may not seem important at the moment for the younger people to realise that modern records are not important, but in 20, 30, 40 years time such records could be of vital importance when somebody starts wanting to write the history of 21st century Manchester. So such records, information on community, where the types of work they did, the kind of thing they did, the type where the people came from, is worth recording and keeping for the future generation. And I must admit, I'm very pleased to see the Chinese community are making a start on this very, very important task. And I would hope that when they finally complete it, if they ever do complete it, there will be an excellent archive tracing the history of the people who've come from China and the Far East, for Manchester, in the Manchester area, for future generations. And not only for the Chinese community, the English community will also be interested, because Manchester has always attracted foreign visitors, I say visitors, people who have come to the city and often to try and make their name, thinking the streets were paved with gold. You've got the Germans, the Jews, you've got the Armenians, you've got the Italians, and in the 20th century you've had the West Indians, you've got the people from the Indian subcontinent, and of course the Chinese community. Each one makes his contribution, and if the records don't survive, they're going to be forgotten about. You don't have any records, oh, they didn't exist. You've got the records, they are there, and that's very important, that they are recorded for posterity. And I would encourage everybody to try and preserve and make sure that the Chinese heritage in Manchester is kept and made sure it's available for the public as a whole.
Perfect. Can you tell us a little bit about the Chinatown?
Yes.
A bit of background about Chinatown.
Well, the Chinatown area, bounded roughly by George Street, Charlotte Street, or George Street runs through the middle of it, is an area which develops in the late 18th century. What actually happened was that Manchester was really, in the Middle Ages, a small, compact town, a market town, centred around the cathedral. And it only gradually started to move out in the mid-18th century. I suppose the development in 1754-55 of the infirmary, where Piccadilly Gardens now stands, was the beginning of that outward movement. When you think you could, even as late as 1792, you could stand at the corner of Princes Street, what is now Princes Street and Mosley Street, and look across open fields. I think it was John Dalton said he could stand where, what is now GMX Manchester Central is, and smell the ozone coming up the rivers. How true that is, I just do not know. But in the late 18th century, you could still watch them hunt the foxes over in Ardwick from central Manchester. That shows you how rural that area was. It wasn't until the 1770s, 80s, that they actually linked the top end of Market Street, Levers Road, Piccadilly, with the turnpike which started at Ardwick Green, going to Buxton and Winslow. They actually built a road out there. After a long argument, who was paying to maintain the road? Oldham Street, for example, doesn't come into the 1770s. So you're getting in a period when things are starting to happen. And he's encouraged by the fact that the Mosley family and other major landowners started to sell off in the 1760s, 70s and 80s their holdings in these growing urban cities. If they'd hung on to them, they'd have made a lot more money than selling them off at that time. And these were bought sometimes piecemeal by various people. And if you look at that general area, Mosley Street, I suppose, is the outer edge of Chinatown. And if you go south towards Portland Street and the river, you will find the whole of that area is built on a traditional gridiron pattern. You people think New York is a gridiron town. Manchester's got it, may have had it even before New York was developed. They're the first for Manchester, you see. And if you look very carefully at the streets in that area, there's a wide street and a narrow street, often parallel to it. Sometimes they're called Back George Street or Back Mosley Street, things like that. And this goes back to the days of the 1780s, 1790s, early 19th century. The big houses would front the main road, the wider road, but many of them had at the back workshops or warehouses, and what happened was that the goods were stored there, or the materials, and then they were put out to people to make in their own homes. And if you've ever read The Manchester Man, then Ashton there had umbrellas made, people made umbrellas at home, and it was where the people came to collect the materials and bring the finished products back with this narrow back area. If you look at street directories for the period, you might find Fred Blogg's 45 Mosley Street, and then a warehouse 42A Back Mosley Street, and 42A in fact is the back of 45. That gives you some idea. They were the back entrances, and gradually those were knocked through. Most of the houses on Mosley Street were cleared in the 19th century. I think it was 1838 when the first warehouse was built, still standing, and it was said that Mosley Street will rapidly become a street of shops, offices and warehouses. And that is the case. The whole of that area started to develop as warehouses. Some very fine buildings. Edward Walters designing things like the ones on Charlotte Street. Travis and Magnall, the big one, Watts Warehouse, better known to many people now as the Britannia Hotel. These are the magnificent warehouses. Many of them, however, on the back streets were less, how shall I put it, less ornate. They were functional, but they all have the similar features. A semi-basement where you could display goods. A ground floor, upper flight of steps. No thought given for those who are disabled, who can't climb steps. And then wide open spaces. As someone once described it, long life, loose fit, or loose fit, long life. You can adapt these buildings, you can put walls in, you can put other floors in, but you needed wide open spaces. And these areas stored goods, but it also meant that manufacturers had no need to encourage their customers to go out, or the travellers to go out to their mills to see what was going on. They could come into Manchester, look at the goods in the warehouses, place their orders, and if they got the stuff stored there, get it out straight away. If they haven't, a quick message to the mill and they can get it in and out into the trains as soon as possible. So the area must have been seething with people. There are pictures of the early 20th century of traffic jams, horses all over the place. And if you try and go down some of these back Mosley Street today, they are very, very narrow, very, very tricky. In fact, in some cases, I don't think a person could lie down on, a tall person have difficulty lying down. And this is where all the hoists, where all the back entrances were. This is where many of the present restaurants have their extractor fans. This is the staff entrances, not where people went in. So you've got large numbers of warehouses going in the 19th century. But it gives you some idea of the growth in the community in the late 18th century. Because on Charlotte Street, between Charlotte Street and George Street, where a modern office, well, modern tower block now exists, it used to be known as St James's Buildings, I think, there was St James's Church, built in 1786 to serve the population of that area, with its graveyard around. And having the church survived until 1931, when its congregation disappeared. It's reported that the Methodists used to attend services at St James' Church before going to their services at Oldham Street Chapel, a quarter of a mile, half a mile away. I often think they must have been gluttons for punishment, because sermons in those days were not 20 minutes, they were an hour and longer. And having done one sermon, go for a second one later on, no thank you. But also tied up with them, often you find Sunday schools. And it's worth mentioning Sunday schools because I don't know the one at St James, but they were often intended to teach children to read the Bible and a prayer book. And if you can read a Bible, you can read a prayer book, you can read anything. And I've often said that people in the 19th century, although said to be illiterate, could probably read. They might not be able to write, but at least they could read. And hence the reason why libraries take off so rapidly in mid-19th century Manchester. Central Library, Free Library it was then known as, 1852. Branch libraries following very shortly afterwards. So you've got education going in the area. There's no map showing most of the schools, but the land there was sold off in plots. And I suppose it's also worth pointing out that just across the road from St James's Church was a major institution, the Manchester Literary and Philosophical Society, the Lit and Phil, started in 1781, amongst whose members were people like John Dalton, J.B. Dancer, James Prescott Joule, Fairbairn, and many of the other scientists and engineers of 19th century Manchester. It's where Dalton announced his atomic theory. It's where Rutherford announced a major modification of it. It's amongst its honorary members people like Bunsen. When you think of the Bunsen burner. And of course it brought together people from a whole range of scientific and technological backgrounds so they could discuss problems. They could even discuss medical problems, but they weren't allowed to mention individual cases, which is always rather entertaining. Politics and history were virtually banned because they were divisive. But this is the area where you've got people coming. And it's worth pointing out that just round the corner from the Lit and Phil, as it was, destroyed in 1940, the Lit and Phil buildings were, there's the Portico Library, 1806. One of the buildings which someone coming back from that period, the beginning of the 19th century, would have actually recognised today. A newsroom at ground floor and a library on the upper floor. And amongst whose members, well, Dalton himself was a member, never paid a subscription, but in fact used to wind the clock and wind vane, the wind director. Well, the Gaskells, William Gaskell was his president for many, many years. And across the road from there, you've got Mosley Street Independent Chapel, which eventually moves out to All Saints to become Cavendish Chapel. You have the Manchester Assembly Rooms, where ladies could dance in the evenings. One of these very nice places, 8 o'clock at night, rules how your carriage could be said. And don't forget, people lived in the area, they lived on Mosley Street. The last person to live on Mosley Street was one of the, I forgot his name now, but he's one of the people on whom the Cheryl Brothers is mirrored in Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. And he lived at the far end, opposite, almost opposite St Peter's Church, and he was there by 1851. So you've still got people living there, but they're gradually going out. And what you've got now in the whole area of warehouses, the street directories, for instance, of 1851 and so on, do list most of the streets who are there. The census, if you've got time to go through the census and numeracy returns, you will find a list of people who are there. Or you'll find warehouse empty, empty, empty. Sometimes if they've got houses, you do find entertaining comments. Left last night is one of the favourite ones, as if the authorities were coming for them. But you can find out multi-occupation. I've not actually examined these census returns for this particular area yet, but I shall no doubt print them off and try and build up a picture of multi-occupation. But I think from 1851 onwards, you'll find that the number of people living there declines. You've got the odd warehouseman, you've got the odd caretaker, but you've also got, not far away, industry. For example, on Faulkner Street, you've got Arms of the Canal coming up, and you've got people like Richard Roberts, the engineer, having a works there. Not very far away was Whitworth's early works. The whole area must have been, in the 19th century, an area which was very, very busy. It would have been an area which was vibrant, I think, just as it's become more vibrant. And I must say that it's thanks to the Chinese community that many of those warehouses have survived. and have been found new uses. They made full use of these big buildings, which are part of Manchester's historic landscape. There are open spaces. Textile warehouses are notorious if they catch fire. Where the Chinese arches, I remember rightly, I think there was a warehouse there which eventually went up in smoke. And if you look at them, many of them have chimneys on the outside walls. I always tell people, walk round, don't look in the shop windows, it's expensive. Look up, you will see all sorts of things. Why the window chimneys on the outside wall? Because in a textile warehouse, if you stack cotton goods or anything else behind a chimney breast and it gets warm, you can get spontaneous combustion. And if a warehouse catches fire, it goes up like a Roman candle. I've got pictures of one or two of them, and if you see the ones in Piccadilly after the Christmas Blitz of 1940, sparks set off the fires there, and they just went up, great whoosh, really. But fortunately, the gridiron pattern there enables each blocks of warehouses to be kept individual, separate, and they're very, very important because the insurance companies could actually say, well, that's isolated, that one. If something catches fire, it can be isolated rather than actually part of the risk spreading to another one. So they did help them, and incidentally, they also assisted your chimney on the outside wall. And if you didn't comply, your premium went up, and so did that of your neighbours. So you got pressure on to obey what the insurance company did. And talking about things like that, there is, I think it covers the area, a series of plans, Gode's insurance plans, which tell you what the warehouses are made of at various times. There was a set, I think there probably still is a set somewhere in Central Library. Very useful for this kind of working out how the warehouses are. The textile industry there, many of the buildings gradually are converted into small offices. And what happens once we get into the 20th century after the Great War, you find the textile industry starts to decline and the area becomes less and less important in the sense of for warehousing of cotton goods. And by the time we get to 1945-46, after the Second World War, the industry is beginning to disappear, and the warehouses, some survive, are either selling imported cotton goods or cotton, or they're finding new uses, or they're left redundant, a risk which of being destroyed, damaged, vandalised. And it's when the Chinese community come along and start, first of all, to convert some of them into, I say, early Chinese restaurants in Manchester, because they are amongst the first.
What year? Can you
We're talking, I would imagine, I don't know the time the first Chinese restaurant arrived.
50s, 60s?
50s, maybe 60s. A street directory for the period, there aren't very many of them, would give you the idea of, if you look into restaurants. Certainly they were there in 62 when I first came to Manchester.
So you went into the Chinese restaurant?
Yes.
What is it like?
Can't remember much about it, but they were very much of a standard kind of how they thought, the English thought Chinese food was. The range, I think, was limited compared with what it would have been, what it is today. So I always remember taking my father into one when I graduated. I'm not going in a Chinese restaurant, I'm not going in an Indian restaurant. He went in both the same day. But you get a decent lunch for about £5 in those days. And there were ones on Deansgate. There was a very good one just below the Lloyds Bank on Cross Street. Not a huge number. Chinatown hadn't really taken off. It was just beginning to take off. But so-called Chinese restaurants, which were beginning to make their mark. And people used them. I think people enjoy them. And it's gradually they take off as an alternative, possibly a better choice than others, that people move out. There was a joke coming from the Midlands in the late 50s, that one or two places, not in Manchester but in Coventry, I think it was, they found tins of kitty cat, which was cat food. And the joke was that they used to use kitty cat for Chinese minced meat. I don't know how true it is, but this was one story. But I suppose they started to make their appearance in the late 50s as a unique new way, because we got the odd Indian restaurant, very few Italian. So you've got restaurants really didn't exist as we know them today. You know, today there's vast numbers within that period, there were very few.
So do you know anything about the laundry side?
I don't offhand. There must have been Chinese laundries around.
Yes.
But I don't know, again, listed in the directories. They must have concentrated on the larger businesses, larger firms, hotels and things like that, I would imagine.
No, domestic.
Domestic.
They're helping the, you know, housewife.
Housewife.
In laundry for the domestic household.
The better class houses, I think. The further out you go, into places like Withington, Didsbury, and into parts of North Manchester, I know the working class women would go to the wash houses.
Where's the wash house?
A wash house is where they would provide not only a baths for people, but where they could actually do their own washing. These were often in the poorer quarters of Manchester, and it was where there were boilers, huge boilers and washing, very early what type of washing machines, drying facilities. This was so they didn't need to, they couldn't do the washing in their own homes and hang it across the road, as some people did. But they eventually closed them down and are replaced by laundrettes. But the Chinese laundry, I think I've got it read somewhere where they were also used by the hotels. You know, quite a lot of hotels in Manchester at that time, based along Piccadilly and in where the down on St Mary's, Victoria Street. Maybe people don't remember Oliver Cromwell there, but it was down there. It's where Harvey Nicks is at the present time. The Midland Hotel, the Grand Hotel, the Queen's Hotel. You know, these were huge places. Visitors from very many places using these hotels. So probably, I don't know, I've not come across any references, but again the directory, if you look into laundries, are bound to find one or two names. And of course, the further out you went, it may be some of them would have gone into houses and actually on a Monday done the washing, being supervised by the lady of the house. And of course, we mentioned food, laundries, and of course once you've got the boats coming in with the Chinese crews, some of them have Chinese crews.
The canal.
The ship canal.
Ship canal.
Yeah.
Is that the one that in Gay Village?
No.
Where?
The ship canal runs from Eastham at Liverpool right the way through to Salford. It's where the BBC are now based. Salford Docks, Salford Quays.
Right.
And you could get vessels up to 12,500 tonnes up to the centre of Manchester near enough. So you had vessels where Salford Quays, where the BBC now is, and where the Lowry is, vessels for foreign ports, further foreign ports, Asia, Africa, Middle East, would sail from. If you went beyond that, further up, Pomona docks 1, 2, 3, 4, they've had coastal traffic and the nearer foreign ports. And these vessels would take English goods out, or particularly textiles, and bring in raw materials and other products as well. So you've got and you've got bunkering facilities further down at Partington. You've got a huge industry in its own right developing, and by the time we get to the 1950s, the port of Manchester is one of the third or fourth largest port in the country. It stretches from Manchester right the way down to the Mersey estuary. It's a huge area, and it still does bring in, at Eastham there's still oil tankers coming in, and there are plans now to bring in more vessels. For example, one well-known firm brings its wine in containers, in barges, and bottles it at Earlham. So if you drink this company's Plonko, it's come by boat and it's been bottled in Earlham. And I gather there's another company doing that. Another company, Kerastar, bring up grain for the starch industry in coasters up right almost into Trafford Park, and then I believe they cross the canal and load up with scrap iron and there's a three-way trade. I'm not quite sure how it works, between France, England, France, or Spain, and Ireland. And these vessels coming up weekly on various occasions. And the aim is to bring more and more ships back up the canal. At one point you could, I went up it in 1970, and we saw half a dozen vessels on a Saturday going down. The trouble is modern ships have got too big for the ship canal. They moved into containerisation, but these early vessels, these ships, would have needed crews, and crews would have come from all parts of the world. It's where some of the earliest Indian subcontinent people arrived by boat and stayed.
What about the Chinese? They stayed in Liverpool.
Not necessarily. They would have stayed in Liverpool because that was a major port. But once you've
What
got...
about Manchester?
They would have come, once they come up to Manchester, they would have started to build their own small communities, you know, around the docks. You know, they might not go back on that particular vessel, or that boat might not sail for about 3 or 4 days. And so they'd establish themselves, little communities, little groups, little place for them to stay. I won't say hotels, but that kind of sleeping accommodation. There might even be places of worship established for this community which are coming in maybe for 3 or 4 days before sailing back across the back to the Far East. So Manchester would start to get its early foreign communities, particularly those associated with shipping, would come in, well, from the 1st of January 1894. One thing we haven't got, I've not come across any, are Chinese used as navvies. I've not found any so far, and there's no reference to these. In some countries, they use them for all sorts of purposes.
What about, you know, during the First World Wars, is there any Chinese involved with the war? Or helping with the war?
Well, we don't know of any locals, but looking at Saiyu, I've discovered an article there a few minutes earlier today of about the Chinese and the Great War, the First World War, nationally, and it looks as if they were involved in that particular front. It's possible if any were around, they were recruited or they volunteered, although I suspect there wouldn't be that many, and there would be problems trying to locate them in particular regiments or particular groups of men. This would be a problem which they'd have to have faced. There can't have been a huge number in this country at the time. They were probably more likely to be at sea on boats, you know, stokers and things like that, rather than actually fighting. Although they could have been used for, I wouldn't say backroom, but backup facilities, you know, things like catering, washing and even tending animals, I suppose. But they appear to have had some involvement. Excuse me, but I think it's an area which should in fact be investigated. And the older members of the community should be asked, did you know, or have your people or ancestors who were over here at the time, do you know of anyone who fought in that war, who was involved? Because next year is the centenary of the outbreak of the war.
Yes, that's right, yeah, we're working on that one as well. But I heard they saying about the Chinese, they do recruit Chinese to be the soldier to defend the war, but they're not recognised.
It's quite possible. And if the names are very English sounding, extremely difficult to locate them. And of course that's one way, if you've got a sense.
And also the seamen if they get involved with the local ladies, they're not allowed to marry them, they're not allowed to stay with them, even they have children.
Oh, that's quite possible. There was always this fear of a mixed community. And we've got a classic example, not involving the Chinese, but those that married Germans. The Lusitania riots of May 1915. You know, anybody with a German-sounding name was a target.
Yes.
Although they were probably naturalised British people. This is the problem, this is the thing which I think people were afraid of. At that time you've still got this attitude, is that anybody other than a European was in fact, I'm going to use a phrase I don't like, of lesser sorts. Yeah, they didn't respect other nationalities, other countries. They felt they were, I'm not going to say savages, but they felt they were not as equal, they weren't equal to other people. They were right as coolies, but not as people with respect. Yet, when you think of it, yeah, the Chinese have produced an awful lot of useful things for society. And just today, the Chinese community, I think, is largely accepted. It's the Muslim community which is not accepted, yet they also got a heritage. So you've got the whole thing going on. And of course, China in the 19th century was regarded as a place to make money, rather than a place for culture and everything else.
I mean, you working in the library all this year. Do you see a lot of Chinese attend the library?
Well, I was in the library until the mid-70s, and we saw very, very few Chinese. I saw more afterwards when one or two people were working on various things, and then you had got a bit of background knowledge, or they wanted something which fitted in with what they were doing. I think some years ago, I can't remember when it was, Yu put something in, some information which I had found for them in. But you didn't see that many. The community kept very much to itself. It's only in, I suppose, the latter years, when they started to rearrange things, that you get the building up of the Chinese library. The Chinese, which was on the second floor, if I remember rightly, in the old Jewish library, local history library rooms. And they moved local history downstairs. So it's only when it becomes more apparent. And local authorities begin to realise that this is a community which has got something to offer which they can make use of. And tourist attraction, the arch, the New Year celebrations, the Chinese New Year celebrations. It's only when they start to realise this that they begin to realise that they've got to do something for it.
So what year you heard about the Chinese New Year celebration?
Well, I can't remember when the first time I heard about them. I suppose one always has bits of appeared in the paper about the Chinese New Year. You've heard of them as abroad. Occasionally you see pictures if you're watching other strange, other places. I suppose mid-80s you begin to hear about celebrations. London's always had a well-known one, and you pick up information from other places. You begin to wonder what's going on elsewhere.
But in fact, we celebrate Chinese New Year earlier than London.
You do?
Open up to the community.
Yes.
So Manchester started much earlier than London.
Yeah, so I'm not sure when it actually started, but I'm sure that there should be newspaper cuttings about it, because it became one of the events, and I think it still is one of the events, and that opening up to the community, the whole community, does in fact bring in not only the Chinese community, it attracts, I'm going to say, Westerners, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that they are drawn into the community, coupled with Chinese food.
Yeah.
People begin to, I'll say assimilate, but get to know the community. And often the names that the Chinese community have, many of the people, sound so English that you begin to wonder, are they English, are they Chinese? Yeah. They become an accepted part of the community, I think.
That's right, yes. I mean, now Chinatown's not only Chinese.
It's full of everybody else.
Yes, we got Thai, you got Asian, you get anybody. You got the banker, you got everybody in there.
But also, you've also got the whole area of that, I say, I call it the Far East. Coming down from China, Indochina, down that area there, which have got people who've migrated within the region. And I think there's always a series of migration downwards for various reasons, refugees as well. And they've assimilated and become part of the actual, the local community. They've got the Chinese have got the technique, the knack of assimilating into the local community and becoming accepted by it. Very much so.
So have you heard anything about the Chinese school side? Chinese school?
I've heard
Sunday school or supplementary school?
I don't know of a Sunday school. There certainly was one. And I think probably schools what goes on privately. You know, they organise themselves, many of these communities organise education for their children so as they do not lose contact with their heritage. And yet, fortunately, it's the reading of Chinese which causes, I think, is a problem from people. But of course, don't forget, we were exporting here, so there'd be English people who would have gone over there, may not have gone to the mainland, particularly in the 19th century because of the restrictions, but certainly trying to get things out there. You've got, I suppose, the Boxer Rebellion, the Opium Wars, all the rest of it going along there, taking place. But again, we don't have any Manchester. Well, there's no record of Manchester people being involved, although almost certainly there would have been on these occasions. And of course, they'd be used maybe in some of the colonial wars as backup staff. Wars, may have been in not Afghanistan, also in South Africa, the Boer War and things like that.
I mean, would you support the children to learn history, modern history? Because I noticed that in mainstream school they were teaching what they call medieval time of history and that kind of thing.
What everyone needs is a basic outline of English history, from the Romans or prehistoric through to the present day, so that at least they've got a timeline, so you know that Alfred the Great, William the Conqueror, Magna Carta, all the major events, and to know when the kings and queens reigned. I think it's important to know that. I must admit, I forgot when some of them were around. But you know, when Queen Victoria, Queen Elizabeth was around, Henry VIII, you need that background to look at it. As primary schools, a general background, more detail when you go to secondary school, and when you're doing, say O-level, but it's GCSE, what do they call it these days, you need probably to concentrate on a particular period, but not, and I think the frightening thing is, what some of us regard as history. You know, when I was at school, history stopped in 1914, First World War. These days it goes much later. I remember my daughter doing something on China and Chairman Mao. And I said, oh, no mention of the little red book. Every student in my day had the little red book, Chairman Mao's little red book. You know, that was the 50s and 60s, the Cultural Revolution. You know, that is today's history.
What I found that even the high school, they don't learn what they call worldwide history. That's where the lack of the information.
There was always a lack of international history.
Yeah.
You knew, you had some dates used to come through. It wasn't until you got to university, I'm talking about the 1960s now, early 60s, that you start to look at European history, and American history, and economic history, unless you were specialising in for A-level doing that. You'd hear about the Indian Mutiny. You'd hear about the Opium Wars, the Boxer Rebellion. But you mentioned the word Afghan Wars to anybody, you suddenly discover that we were involved in Afghanistan in the 1870s, but not in detail. No one looks at it in detail. There needs to be a facility so people can look at other, I'm going to say civilizations, which I think is the phrase very important, because every civilization has its own bit to offer. It may be only a general outline of what they've achieved. China, you couldn't do the whole world history in a volume. Was it Toynbee said world history, and his volumes mirror a large number of them. But you could in fact give an outline of some of the local, where you've got local communities like the Chinese, Middle Eastern history, which I think is essential for people to know a bit about, European history, which you tend to get involved with the two major wars of the 20th century, but you need to go back. You can't look at them all in isolation.
Yeah, but you know, like Opium War is so important between the British and the Chinese.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, I think they should actually include in
It should be part of the
education side, but there's none of them mentioned in it.
It should go with the British.
How do you feel about that?
I think it should be included. Probably, if they do anything, it's in the British Empire, expansion of empire bit. But I would include our involvement in the Far East. I'm using the Far East there Far East there in general term.
Yeah.
It's all tied up with trade. I think this is important, particularly around Manchester, because trade is vital. And I think it was the Chamber of Commerce in 1914, 2 or 3 days before war broke out, cabled the government to say, look, tell the Germans to leave the North Sea ports and the Channel ports alone, and we should agree to stay out of the war, so we can actually trade. You know, we want to carry on our normal business. We don't want interruption. And this is what their attitude was. And it always has been. Look, stay out of foreign affairs, let's get on and trade. And one has to remember that people did go abroad. And we do have, you tied in with, I think, trade, economic history. Because I don't think we sold the Chinese any railway engines in Manchester. We might have done, but we don't. I can't recall any done from Bear Peacocks. But you see, this is it. You send people abroad with stuff, and next thing you know, something's gone wrong. So you send someone out to fix it, and they get to know what's going on. Sometimes you've got this close community attitude. I think China had quite a close community attitude. They want to keep the foreign merchants away from the average Chinese citizen. Keep them on the coast. That's when you've got Hong Kong, was it Macau, the new territories, bits along there, keep them along there in certain towns, but try not to let them get further in because it might threaten the emperor and his position. So you've got this, you've got a problem between the two. You know, what we wanted and what they wanted, and I think that's very important to point this out.
Can you tell us a little bit about Hong Kong?
Well, this is not Manchester history, but I do know.
But because Manchester got lots of Hong Kong Hakka people in Manchester to begin with.
Yeah. I discovered this reading something today. I've only been to Hong Kong a couple of times and come up with them. And I suspect it's because they've been gradually forced from their normal place of residence. Possibility of work, possibility of employment. But don't forget, Hong Kong was a port. It was a place where you could take goods and import them. It was a shipping port, a port for shipping. And no doubt, having got people on their boats and working on boats, they come over here, some settle, and it's possible that some of the people there who, if I remember right, we were told, were being displaced from much further north, have opportunity to come out and establish themselves in a new area. And of course the other area where they used to go down to was down to Australia. And one has to remember that there is a direct link between England and Australia, and there's probably some involvement there because they were taken out for the, well, they were locked away down for the Victorian gold rush at Ballarat and Bendigo and things like that. And it's possible that some actually made their way back round from there, so you've got a whole network developing. And how many were taken out to, I wouldn't say slave labour, but to work for the British Army in South Africa in the Boer War, or in other parts. We just don't know. I don't know it anyway, but the information must exist if people start looking for it.
It's fascinating, isn't it? You know, like in Chinatown, to begin with, there's a lot of Hakka Chinese who built the Chinatown, and then change it into Cantonese, and then now, you know, lots of Mandarin in.
It's evolving, and I think this happens to any community. They evolve rather than violent change. So yeah, one community changes to evolves to another and another. As things change, new people come in, new ideas, and they evolve. And I think this is how they develop. So eventually they become indistinguishable from the existing community, unless they make a special effort to maintain their own individualism. And
how do you feel when you first seen the Chinese arch In Chinatown.
I suppose I felt very proud that they thought Manchester was sufficient to have this symbol.
Like a landmark.
It's a landmark, but I felt it's, well, Manchester is the second city of the empire. Therefore, we need to. I suppose, like many things in Manchester, although I'm an adopted Manchester, I don't live in Manchester now, but I haven't come up here, I've been up 50 odd years. Manchester to me is always a major city, an important city, and I'm always referred to as the second city of the empire. Birmingham was just a suburb of London. So this is the kind of thing, I know other population-wise, other places are bigger, but in the 19th century, ideas which came out of Manchester, things like free trade, the microphotograph, the lantern slide, the mechanical equivalent of heat. All of them come out of people in Manchester. Say free trade, even suggestions of universal education. Manchester was quite prepared to adopt anybody, provided they didn't cause trouble. In Manchester in the 19th century, people were quite accepted. There's an article sometime, I fear it was journalism, describing the wide range of communities you've got in and around Manchester. I get on Market Street, referring to the Middle Easterners, the Armenians, the whole lot, all distinguished by their own costume. It's part of the scene of Manchester. After all, trade does bring in people. I know I've looked through the censuses for some of the hotels. I've not analysed them in detail. I don't think I've found any Chinese in the couple I've looked at in the 1860s and 70s, but I'm sure there must have been some around. And likewise was the Hotel de Tranche on Piccadilly. Claimed its staff spoke most European languages, but I'm afraid I did not find a Chinese speaker.
We found the censor, we found one Chinese called Asan, which is, got the same surname as me.
Yeah.
In Bury.
In Bury.
And another one in Glossop.
In Glossop?
Yeah, in 1850.
1850s. I'm going to say Glossop's quite an unusual place to find.
Those are the servants who work for the mill owner.
Yes.
The cotton mill owner.
This is a possibility if they've been out there or they've got contacts. I suspect there are others around. The problem with the Manchester census for 51 is that the southern part of the city centre, Chorlton-on-Medlock and that area, was very heavily damaged in the Public Record Office. There are various stories as to how it happened, such as being moved across London on the back of an open truck when it rained. They managed to get some of the stuff back, but there's a lot of stuff missing. So the area where you might have found them, they've disappeared. 1861, 71. And I always say, don't rely on some of these modern, like Ancestry or Find My Past or these various indexes. If you really want to make sure they're there, you've got to go through the originals or the microfilm or digital version of them, because the transcripts you find on these sites, there are a lot of mistakes, very serious mistakes.
Yeah, I noticed that because, when they say in the early 19th century there's a lot of Chinese laundry, actually business going on in Manchester, but there isn't much of the photograph or information about them. It's like disappear.
Yes, early 20th century really, my photographs. They may exist, they may be in private collections, or they may not have liked to have their photographs taken. This is the
yeah,
other.
but even the shops, information about a shop, a laundry shop.
Yeah.
We just couldn't find any information
Not
about
surprised, because directories were compiled by commercial firms, and if they felt that people didn't need to know about it, or they weren't prepared to pay, they would not get in. The place to look through are the rate books.
Rate books?
The rate books. These are
the rates, the business rates.
Yes. They are on film in Manchester
Right.
for the census years, and that theoretically should give you not only the owner of the property, but the name of the person
Oh,
occupying
right, that's
it.
interesting. I never thought about that.
Have a look through there. They will give you the use of the building as well, which is very, very useful. But the directories may, if you look at them, you have got the list of names, but you may find that occupation, not occupations, but businesses, for example, laundries, if you look down there, or they may in fact anglicise the name. You know, Peter Wong, and it may be spelled W-R-O-N-G, Peter Wrong. You know, so you've got to bear it, things can be transcribed, and in the census the same thing can happen. You know, you get people born in strange places, or they say, well, quite a few at sea, abroad. They just say Shanghai, and they may not spell it the way we spell things today.
Oh, right, okay.
So you've got all that to bear in mind. There are all sorts of changes which you could find taking place.
Right, okay. You know about the Chinese magazine?
Yes.
The one that...
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Can you give us some advice?
Yes. Very important document. I've seen a couple of copies myself. I believe you told me that this was in fact the first Chinese publication for the Chinese community.
In UK.
In the UK. Well, I hope you've got a complete set to start off with, almost a complete set. But looking through it, it gives you quite a lot of information about the community, of interest not only to the Chinese community, but also to anybody who's interested in community relations in the area. This one here, for example, program on housing, advice from people. Another one here, the way to equality. Police maintaining law and order. Information which you might not find, but in the future someone could very well be interested. Articles on Eastern Horizon, the Chinese community in Holland. So you've got that kind of thing. Careers advice, and it is also a bit of a tip here. Small print worth reading. Chinese story. International Youth Year. There's a whole series of things in this, both in English and Chinese, and I presume the English bit is the same as the Chinese, but in Chinese, and they've just translated it. And it tells you the various pages. Yes, there's a contents page here. Very, very important, and I think even the adverts would be fascinating, not only to Chinese, but also to the English people as well. You know, Henry Nuttall, Meloroid Works, looks like I'm making a cooking range. You know, this is the kind of thing which is useful for not only one community but the other. And ideally what you should do with it is index it. It can be a long, slow process, but an index which would be very, very useful. So if somebody was researching, say, we mentioned the First World War, the Great War. I know that glancing through, there's an article there, they can find that article, and it may be they can follow it up from there. But indexing is not an easy job, and once you can do it, these days on a computer it's a lot easier than you can do it in 5x3 cards, which I know somebody else knows about. One card at a time and sort it, whereas a computer you can actually sort it, provided you save it regularly, you don't lose it. You can actually find it. So there's a lot of information in these things which in fact should be kept and made available, so that people do know exactly what there is in these. After all, what was it, this is going back, 1960s, Central Library, the local history department, started indexing some of the Victorian journals going back to the 1860s, a century after they'd have been published. And the wealth of material in them was quite tremendous. So try and get it done before you actually get too many copies. Is it still published?
No.
Oh, was it?
They stopped it in 1996.
Well, you've at least got a finite number of issues to do.
But what I want anybody, who got a copy, if they can donate it to us,
Yes,
then we can build a collection.
I would make sure you get a set. Because anyone doesn't want, don't throw it out.
Yeah.
Put it in this collection here, so at least people know where it is. And at some point, it's going to provide vital information for someone who is going to be writing a complete history of the Manchester Chinese community, because you never know what sources exist and what you might need. And the ideal thing would be, as someone has suggested, digitise them but keep the safe copy of the hard copy, and make sure they're kept under safe conditions. We don't want a situation like happened to the Lytton Phil at George Street in the war. It went up in smoke and lots of valuable records disappeared. Likewise, did computer discs, memory sticks can all disappear. Technology changes. So you need 2 or 3, at least a safe place to keep these, and microfilm's often a way to do it. It used to be a way of doing it, it may still be, so that people can actually look at it. You've got a master copy and you can do other prints, and it's as easy to see as sometimes on a computer, and nothing like as electronic, because you can actually handle a microfilm far easier than I think computers, because you can move through far faster and scan. So even microfilming might be a start, getting them sorted out and then store them in ideal conditions. Constant temperature, low humidity, no people in the room if possible regularly, no direct sunlight. In other words, keep them safe out of the way, because some of them are made on good quality, really good paper.
Sounds like we better hand it over to the Manchester City Archives, isn't it?
Well, before you do that, make sure
I want to leaving it around, so they will...
Make sure you've got a copy of it.
Yeah.
See, you've got copies, because your own archive needs them. Once you've got a copy made, or you'll get them to make a microfilm or a digital copy, any duplicates you could sit on, but I think there are 1 or 2 duplicates there. But make sure that you've kept a copy yourself, so that if anything happens, you've got them. But even a room like this, okay, you've got sunlight in, or a darkened room, they'll be safe in there, provided people don't go in regularly.
I normally stored it at the back of the stairs.
Yeah, well.
But
certainly
the most beauty of the magazine is they're not professional writer, what they call community.
They're community documents. They chart the history of the community in the West in many respects.
Yes.
And there's some pictures in here which are rather entertaining. There was one I noticed somewhere in here, in this particular one. That's GMC today. Reports on politics, supplementary benefit, immigration, all very, very important. Information about the problems affecting and influencing the community at that time.
Yeah, that's great. There's something that I'd like to ask you as well. This might be nothing to do with the archive, okay? Because I'm trying to help these Manchester steering group, that list that I show you, with all the people from the museum, like People's Museum, War Museum, and then the City Archive, the whole team of people there, what they call the top of Manchester culture,
Yes.
It is the what they call Manchester Culture Steering Group,
yes.
Okay, to lead the people. What I suggested to them is about the, because you're talking about the tourist attraction for Manchester. What I found, the information about, trying to attract Chinese tourists coming into Manchester, is nothing there, for me to promote about Manchester. How do you feel that, if you can actually put something together, like a small booklet, like what you're just saying to me, John Dalton, who, and then Elizabeth Gaskell, and then all this is like, to me, it's really interesting that every one of them how do you feel that if we can put something together and then I'm going to get someone, my volunteer, to translate that in Chinese,
Something can be
and
put,
then we can publish it, and then I can actually distribute it out to China.
it's not difficult to put stuff together on Manchester. There are one or two things around which have that kind of information in. I don't know what the tourist offices are up to these days. They keep very close to themselves.
No, what they say, they always say, look at my website,
Oh, well, this is it. But
look it online.
But you don't want a website or online when you're a tourist.
No, not everybody
You-
can get online, you know.
But you need a piece of paper in your
Yeah.
pocket.
Yeah,
Something which, if it gets wet, well, it gets damaged. Well, you can get a replacement. That's what my view is. You know, something which you can see, and you can do it simply. You may not be great detail. You know, this is where John Dalton lived. This is where
Yes.
this is where St James Church were.
Yeah.
The dates,
Yes.
things like that, and then provide a short reading list at the end for further information.
yeah,
See the following books.
yeah.
Yeah, for more detail.
Or they can do like the tour guide.
You can do a
Yeah.
tour round,
Yeah,
but you want something which just gives the basic facts.
yeah.
Um,
So where can we get that kind of information?
Once you know the building in question, depends how type of area you want to cover.
See, the one that you just talk, you know, like that street to that street and who's in
If
there,
you-
who's
yeah.
in there. That's really fascinating. That's what we need.
There is a very useful book which I would have thought, Chinatown's quite a large, not a large area, but what you do is cover the
I'm not talking about Chinatown
You're talking about
only
city
now.
centre.
I want to talk about whole Manchester.
the city centre.
I want to promote Manchester.
Right, the city centre. You could, in fact, just trying to think what there is. I have got something which might be the idea to base it on, not base on, but it could actually be adapted. I've picked up Big Sock published a thing based on Manchester Man. Now, once you've got a basic street pattern, it does the idea of very short notes. They published something in the 50s or in the 70s or 80s. I'd have to have a look and see what there is, but
Yeah.
I'm sure
Yeah.
you can do something pointing out, say, the existing buildings,
Yeah,
the cathedral,
yeah,
Market Street, the Royal Exchange, St Anne's Church, Free Trade Hall, the old Bank of
Yes.
England building, the site of the original town hall,
Yes.
the town hall, Albert Square, Theatre Royal, where St Peter's Square is. You could in fact put a dozen or so, not 2 dozen buildings and sites. Peterloo, of course, the statue of Lincoln, John Ryler's library.
Yeah.
You could put many of these, they can be easily dealt with in a
Yeah.
route. I think, yes.
yes.
That's right.
I think we need, because I mean at the moment now what I found that lot of tourists, Chinese tourists is going to London, they stop in London and then they get a coach, you know, tour round, and they only, when they go to mid district, they only stopped in Manchester for a really short time,
Yeah.
and then they on the way to
On the way again.
to Sesbia's home.
Yes.
You with me? So it's like, to me, they could spend in the whole week in Manchester.
Well, could easily spend a whole week in Manchester.
Yeah, but we need to promote each of the landmarks.
Yes, and you
Yeah.
see, Central Science Museum, Mosey. Okay, it's been under threat, but the world's first passenger railway station.
Yeah,
You need to include that
Yeah.
kind of thing.
yeah,
The museum,
yeah,
the Roman fort even.
yeah.
Yeah.
But you see, at the moment now, I couldn't find any books or anything that we can, you know, base on, you know, like a landmark of Manchester or something.
I have got stuff at home which I will have a look for you.
Yeah.
But I won't be able to do anything before the end
No,
of
no,
next
I
month.
don't expect anything will be overnight.
Because,
but I just wonder, you know, can the people or somebody know or something, you know, can maybe one of, you know, each of us doing a paragraph or even a note or half page
Well, the ideal
to
thing
build
would
the
be
whole things
is
together.
to do several different areas. Castle Field is one block.
Yeah.
Chinatown's another.
Yes.
Round the cathedral's another.
Yeah.
And St Anne's Square, that area.
Yeah.
St Anne's Square, King Street. those are the kind of things you probably each would be a separate area.
Yes.
Because if you did the whole lot as a single unit,
No.
it'd be far too much for
No,
people to go
but,
around. You'd end up
but
with
at
mass
least, you know, we
education.
can chip them together,
You
join
can-
them
yes.
together, yeah.
You could put them together to create a kind of little pamphlet.
Mm.
Yes, that can be done.
I think that can be make, you know, like the way that you just said, you know, we just
You could do
record
it, there's no
for
problem.
each of the streets and what's been going on in the past. I mean,
Yes.
that's a very fascinating
You
story.
could
I mean,
very, very briefly outline
Yeah.
it. But you couldn't make it a very, if you want for someone to have a walk round, you don't want a lot of detail, you
No,
just want the
no.
basic facts.
basic facts and information, history.
History, yes. You know, look where the chimneys are. Look up and see what there is.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's, you know, that would be my next project.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, now the Science Museum, we know it's been under threat, but hopefully it'll be saved. But its history goes back far earlier than the present location at the Liverpool Road Station. It was started about 1965, 1966 by the Department of History of Science at UMIST. And this, the idea was to try and collect machinery which no one else was collecting, particularly the very large machinery which was rapidly disappearing off to the scrapyards and archives of some of the major firms. And amongst the first firms to be rescued were the records of Bayer Peacock, locomotive builders to the world, and some of the general arrangement drawings and drawing office books survived and were brought over to the museum, together with 3 tons of glass negatives showing virtually every model of engine they built. Gradually, over the next, I suppose, decade, the collection gradually increased. Stuff was put out in store. Originally it was run by one person, then he got a secretary, then he got a deputy. There was a photographer who retired from Central Library who gets involved. Collections are gradually rescued from various places. I was involved with some of the archival collections, including Craven Brothers and a firm, I can never remember which one it was, which was stored in where was it? In an old air raid shelter, and we had to paddle in to get them. The McNaught drawings, that's right. That was the kind of thing which, you know, was done to save it. Steam engines, textile spinning mules, anything which could be technologically important. And not only was it big machines, things like scientific instruments. Because don't forget, Manchester was a major scientific instrument maker. People like Dalton had their thermometers made by J.B. Dancer, who incidentally took Manchester's first photograph, we think. He also invented the microdot, although London thought they claimed it and Manchester managed to prove otherwise. He invented the lantern slide. He developed microscopes which were cheap enough for students to have. He made these thermometers for Dalton, and also for Joule for the mechanical equivalent of heat. So a lot of stuff was collected there on that front. And then there were examples of printing, textile printing, and some of the blocks salvaged and saved before they were scrapped. Machine tools, even parts to deal with motor cars.
So was there any resistance from the collection of this material by public bodies? Questions asked why you were saving it?
No, they weren't interested.
So it was under the radar?
It was quite legal and quite legitimate. After it was privately owned, and the museum was run by the university, not by any public bodies, although they gradually became involved, putting in some investment. And really the local authorities don't get involved until space starts to run out, I think is the phrase. And then in 1975, 6, British Rail announced they were going to close Liverpool Road Station, the world's oldest first passenger railway station. That created an uproar, and eventually British Rail agreed to hand that over together with the original station building, I think also the warehouse, to Greater Manchester. And they eventually decided that the Science Museum, after the Great Railway Exposition of 1980, should in fact be moved down to the station, and over the next few years the station was adapted to take the exhibits. Amongst the earliest to arrive was a Bayer Garrett locomotive from South Africa, a monster with, I forget, it's a 3'6" gauge, which stand by the wheels and you look, it dwarfs you. Also on close by was an Air and Space Museum in the old Lower Campfield Market, known for City Hall, and the two were eventually merged to provide a museum of the Manchester Air and Space Museum, or Greater Manchester Museum of Science and Industry. And the concentration was on industry as well as science. Probably the greatest stress was actually on the industrial side of things. After all, industry was the major lifeblood of Manchester and the surrounding area. It was said on one occasion that 40% of this country's exports in the 19th century emanated from Manchester and the surrounding area. A third of the exports, by the way, were textiles. So it gives you some idea of the importance of many of this machinery and equipment. And fortunately it was saved from the area. Even at one point there was the National Paper Collection. National Paper Museum was stored at Manchester Science Museum. So it shows you how important it was. It's had its ups and downs, but it does represent a major collection of material in Manchester and the country. And it's technologically, more to the technological side. And one has to remember also you've got people like Whitworth, Roberts, and machine tool makers. It was in the northwest that you start to get machine tools being made, machines to make machines, to get accuracy, and to have mass production. This starts to come along during the mid-19th century, and Manchester is at the forefront of this.
Wow, that is amazing!
Well, the town hall you were asking about, the present town hall, dates from 1877. The earlier building stood at the corner of Cross Street and King Street, where Lloyd's Bank is now located, and that was built in the 1820s by the police commissioners who ran Manchester at the time. I should point out that the word police does not mean law and order, it means government. So there was people who were running the government of the town. One end was the day watch and night watch offices, the other was the police commissioners' offices. Eventually, in 1838, when Manchester becomes a borough, the town hall technically should have gone straight to the borough council. But due to objections from the police commissioners and queries about the legality of Manchester's charter, it was really 1840-41 before the whole issue was in fact resolved. Now that town hall continued to operate until the 1870s, although by the 1860s they were beginning to get worried that it wasn't large enough. Local government was expanding and departments were being forced out. For example, it had taken over supplying water in the 1840s, late 40s, early 50s. So the water supply the water department needed a new home. Already gas was being supplied, markets were taken over. And so in the mid-1860s, about 1863, they look at the possibility of building a brand new town hall. They look at about a dozen sites, and eventually the one they choose is the one which is partly owned by the council, where the engineer's yard is. They just buy some houses in front of a new square which has just been created to house the statue of Prince Albert, Albert Square. Work started in 1867-68 to build the new building. The design by Waterhouse was the result of the competition. He was the overall, he was the best design which suited the requirements stipulated. Although some people thought his design wasn't the best in appearance sake. The town's largest building contractor could not actually put a tender in to do the work this is Neil's, because Councillor Neil was mayor at the time, and there were strict rules about people being connected with the council and getting contracts, which I think is a very interesting point. The town hall was not completed until 1877 or late 76, although some departments had moved in quite early on. It's a triangular building, although most people don't realise it's the case, with a hollow courtyard. It opened in February 1877 with a procession of councillors and aldermen from the old town hall to the new town hall. And when was the last time you saw the whole city council march through the streets of Manchester, led by the junior councillors, etc.? The official opening took place in September 1877. They had hoped to get Queen Victoria to come and open it, but she would not. And there are various explanations for this, or suggestions. One was that she objected to the statue of Oliver Cromwell, which had been erected near the cathedral, by Mrs. Abel Haywood in memory of her first husband, Alderman Goadsby. And it said that if she ever came to Exchange Station, she'd never come there because Cromwell had his back to her. It's now to be found, by the way, in Wythenshawe Park. The other suggestion was that, I think it's the more likely one, that Abel Haywood, who was mayor at the time, supported Chartists and was a very keen supporter of the events of 1848 in Europe. And Queen Victoria did not like the Chartists. In fact, in 1848, when the Troubles took place, she fled to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight to be away from the Troubles in London. So that's probably the reason why. But then, who's the second most important person in the empire? Be up next after the Queen. Why? The Mayor of Manchester. So he opened it himself, and it ended up with what they call a Grand Trades Procession, where the reviewing platform, on the reviewing platform was the Mayor, and representatives of all the various trades and organisations and unions marched past him. 20,000 are said to have taken part in this event. So the town hall itself opened in 1877, and within a short period of time was too small. When they had a electricity department, well, the gas department moved out first. It moved out to a building on Deansgate, and then the electricity department had a building in Sedan Street. Again, as the council expanded, so you get the town hall becoming too small. And in 1938, George VI opened the town hall extension, which lay between the town hall and Central Library. So
that's amazing. I wish all the history teacher could talk like you. But thank you very much. It's been very, very useful.
It's a pleasure.
Oh, you can spend an all day here talking to me. But anyway, so thank you very much. I'll take enough of your time now.